I shall pass this way but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, or any human kindness that I can show to any human being, let me do it now. Let me not deter or neglect it, for I shall pass this place but once. This quote, I think, helps us think about altruism and really any behavior that we would engage in that is aimed at benefiting another person. Now, most theorists believe that there are two major reasons why we would engage in altruistic behaviors. One of those is that we may be motivated by egotism. The other is that we're essentially motivated by empathy, and that the empathy is irrespective of any sort of personal gain. Now, most scholars have suggested that egotism fuels altruistic behaviors because all altruistic actions produce some sort of underlying benefit. So when we talk about egotism, what we're talking about is essentially any behavior that is motivated by personal gain or benefit, that there's some sort of personal interest. So egotistical altruism essentially when we do something that's good for someone else because of our own self-interest. And so there's really three major ways in which altruistic behaviors could benefit the self. We could receive external rewards, that might be monetary rewards or personal praise. We could lessen our own sense of guilt, avoiding social or personal punishments for failing to help, or we could reduce our own distress that we feel from seeing another person's misery. And so when we think about empathy, it's really much more of the pure or altruistic type of hypothesis. So empathy obviously is when we have a particular emotional response to observing the plight of another person, of the distressing situation that another person might feel, and it's when our emotions really match the other person's emotion. So it sort of involves this tender-heartedness that we would experience towards another person by experiencing sort of the negative situation that they're in. So Batson and his colleagues said that altruistic behaviors were, at least to a certain degree, prompted by this empathy that we're feeling. And so he would say that individuals that are higher and more empathetic are more likely to help those in need. Not to say that that there isn't any egotistical altruism, but to say that at least some of the time altruistic behaviors are motivated by empathetic emotional experiences. So I wanted to talk, maybe give a couple of examples here. So maybe you can imagine a child is playing with her sibling and sort of accidentally gets into some sort of rough situation, and the sibling ends up falling down and getting hurt. And if the child, essentially the help that they provide, the comfort that they're providing is because they don't want to experience punishment, that would be egotistical altruism. However, if a woman was in a grocery store and she's attempting to do something and is obviously having difficulty with it, and someone else feels compassion and helps that person out, that would be what we consider sort of the empathy motive. And so when we think about these different types of motives, we can also think about the ways in which there are gender and cultural variations in the way that people would help other individuals out. So there was a series of studies on the dictator game, which is sort of a situation where you're given a certain number of coins and you can just altruistically give another person a certain number of coins, really for no benefit to yourself. And what we find in those types of situations is that females are more likely to give coins than males in the dictator game, showing sort of like this economic sort of altruistic type of behavior. Now, I think that this needs to be qualified because characteristics and personality traits like agreeableness and conscientiousness were much more important than gender. And in particular, actually, both men and women are appreciative of altruistic traits in long-term types of relationships. Also, when we think about cultural differences, we can actually see that the sort of collectivistic situations or the collectivistic societies might actually conceptualize altruism in a certain type of way that would actually impact the likelihood that a person would help another individual. So there might be a question about, well, okay, how do we cultivate empathy? Really, in many ways, it's one of the most simple ways you can do that is simply just to interact with people, specifically people who are in need of help. And so you think about the sort of typical situation around Thanksgiving. This was a situation in my family where we went and we would help those who were less fortunate by feeding them meals during Thanksgiving. As a young adolescent, this was uncomfortable, but this should cultivate sort of a sense of empathy by simply being in the presence of a person who's sort of in needing help. So number one, to cultivate empathy, interacting more frequently with people who need help. And when you're in that sort of situation, purposely trying to identify the similarities that you have with the person that's in need, as opposed to the differences that you might actually have with that person. As the book sort of talks about, and others have, that these sort of shared characteristics help us see that we're all sort of on this grand journey. Children, you can actually help cultivate empathy by helping them have a wider and diverse circle of friends. Again, to sort of help them sort of see the similarities with people with diverse backgrounds. You can also cultivate altruism by helping people feel that empathetic or egotistical motivations aren't necessarily bad. Just because it feels good to help others doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't actually try and increase helping types of behaviors. Okay, so now we're going to spend just a few minutes on forgiveness. The F word, it actually comes in the end part of the chapter, but we're going to flip the order of these a little bit. So quite interestingly, really the only general consensus in the forgiveness literature is that forgiveness is good for people. There's many different definitions of forgiveness, what it actually means to forgive, and so these different types of conceptualizations actually play this incredibly important role in the way that people not just define the construct, but how they actually end up using them in their daily life. So really the only agreement that researchers have is that forgiveness is beneficial to all people. So McCullough and his colleagues and Enright and his colleagues actually talked a little bit about how there are these two emotional sides of forgiveness. From McCullough's side, forgiveness is really this sort of pro-social motivation, a decreased desire to sort of seek revenge, but also an increased desire to act positively towards the transgressor. And so because you had to have these two components to it in McCullough's definition, forgiveness can only happen, to individuals. It can't be extended to sort of situations. In Enright's definition, forgiveness is essentially giving up negative emotions like resentment and negative judgment, and actually extending undeserved positivity like compassion and generosity and benevolence, again, to the transgressing person. And because of that, forgiveness can only happen to individuals. Can only be extended to people. Tangy and colleagues really focused on how the sort of giving up of negative emotions is the core. So as opposed to the other two researchers, really it's the negative emotionality that's the core. And Thompson actually is the probably biggest divergence from all these theories, because not only is this sort of forgiveness is specifically freeing yourself from this negative attachment of the transgression, but also that the forgiveness can be extended to oneself or to a person or even to a situation. So, all of these definitions really just show the great diversity in this. There's a lot of variation in forgiveness. So, when is forgiveness likely to occur? when the transgressor actually apologizes, when the transgressor states that he or she will sort of make things right, when the apology was not required by some sort of authority figure. These sorts of situations make anyone more likely to forgive. We also see age differences. Older individuals are just more likely to forgive than younger individuals, and in some cultures forgiveness may be a very interpersonal process, and in others it may be a very intrapersonal process. So we see a lot of diversity and variations in forgiveness.